Yeah, well, I'm sure there's some mathematical or biological answer even to what you're saying about me right there, which we've discussed privately many times, so I'm more than happy to discuss it publicly as well. You know, it's funny, when I've sat down, first off, I think your basic premise is actually correct, as I've said to you privately, but when I've sat down with all of these supposed scary right-wingers, so we have Shapiro and Prager and Gutfeld and Glenn Beck and whoever else it may be, they have actually no problem publicly and privately having disagreements with me.
Yeah.
No problem. We don't slander each other, we don't slur each other, we don't hate each other, we don't unleash mobs on each other. So yes, I actually feel very comfortable with them, even though we have certain political disagreements now, where I don't get that on the other side. I don't think you get it on the other side.
No, you and I have this crazy thing where I'm always asked, why are you hanging around with Rubin, you know, because fundamentally, you know, he's really right-wing and he refuses to correct. And you get, why don't you have left-leaning people on your show? And so it's like, are you aware that you're talking to both of us and that we're able to compare notes?
But the irony is that both of you, by default of your upbringing and everything else, I think you certainly were on the left for basically your whole adult life.
Yes.
And I think basically you were too. It's a little, I don't even know where to put you anymore, but that shows how the map just means nothing anymore. It just doesn't mean anything. What means something is that little place you're talking about on the canvas. And that place at the moment happens to be center-right, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that so I'm raising my children, at least my son, on these old Tom Lehrer records. And Tom Lehrer was this incredible pianist, and he wrote naughty, dirty little songs, you know, way back in the 1950s that were incredibly clever and witty and talked about politics. And if you play them today, you know, I think about Barney, I love you, you love me, and then you have Tom Lehrer saying, I hold your hand in mine, and it's a severed hand. You know, and it's just, he was making fun and joking about our hatred for each other across ethnic lines, about sexual misbehavior. And, you know, we grew up in a house in which this was normal, and it produced a kind of, I don't know, immunologically sophisticated rather than an immunologically naive perspective, where we've created this very safe world for children now, and I think our world was not safe. And you know, I think it's very important to look at what the effects of that. If you watched Vietnam on television during the 60s and early 70s, as I did, the images that were beamed into every living room look like no images that were beamed in from the Iraq War or even the collapse of the Twin Towers. So you have a very different world and a very different situation that I think we grew up in. And what you and I find when we're told either, you know, don't do Rubin's show or why don't you have left-wingers on, is that the left is behaving in some sense like a cult. A cult is always wondering, did you talk to anyone outside? Mm-hmm. Well, if you talk to somebody outside, then you might have ideas come in that disconfirm what the cult has been telling you. And so the fact that you and I always want to talk, I mean, I'll talk to a convicted killer. I'll talk to somebody with horrible views. Because even if I just want to protect myself against that person, I want to understand how they think. How can you not watch, if you think Fox News is the enemy, why wouldn't you listen to the enemy's broadcasts? Mm-hmm. Right? And so this idea of revulsion, I cannot possibly even bear 2 seconds of that voice or that idea or that person, is a tell. And it's a tell that the person is trying to say, don't worry, I haven't spoken to anyone outside of our cult.
Yeah, these rules that are established are tactical, and they are rationalized as if they were about some sort of a sophisticated conclusion, but they simply aren't. And so, you know, I'm not sure this is the right analogy. I don't want to trivialize it this way, but I almost feel like the left has revived the schoolyard game of cooties, right? That there's certain people you just can't talk to because you'll catch their disease. And it's like, actually, that's not how it works. You can talk to people with whom you disagree, and you can actually, I mean, the whole process of intellectual dialogue, of dialectic, is to gain from the conversation that which you didn't know that's actually valuable and reject that part that isn't and persuade the other person of something. So the whole idea that we shouldn't be talking to these people because they are beyond the pale is preposterous on its face. Likewise, the idea that free speech is all well and good, but there are certain ideas that shouldn't be voiced. These things they're transparent nonsense.
Is there some biological analogy you can give me for what Eric just laid out there? So for the two of us that get, as you said, catapulted out of this thing, that we end up in a new space, and now we see some decency there, so then the ideas start spreading there. There's got to be some biological something there.
Well, in some ways, this is a brand new situation. It would be very unusual for an ancestral human to have been ejected from their group and to find a home in another group. That's not typically the way it works. Typically, being ejected from your group is a fatal circumstance. That is much less true. The world we live in is very unusual because reciprocal altruism is really, it has taken over. And in some ways, you know, this is dicey because you have antecedents in the Torah, but the New Testament actually prioritizes reciprocal altruism across a larger group. Now, it's clearly not universal because when the Christians get to the New World, they treat the people in the New World as if they're not part of the same species. But nonetheless, the ability to forge a union that is not based on genetic lineage is novel. On the other hand, it's also beautiful, that there's a kind of, if it were genes, we might call it hybrid vigor. But there's a way in which you take people who bring different kinds of wisdom from different traditions that have faced different challenges, and you put them together and you get superpowers. So anyway, it is very exciting to see it. What?
When it works.
But I would say
when
that,
it works.
so, but I think what you're saying is that's starting to happen right now, right?
Well, I would
Because
guess,
there's something now that's clearly, to me, far bigger than any of us happening. For the amount of people that are either watching this live or will watch this, that will then spread some of these ideas and realize that they're not the hostages, the intellectual hostages that they think they are.
Well, maybe there's a missing piece here, which is our economic system, when you plug it into certain things very directly, like journalism, I think actually this is your point originally, that it's truth-seeking, which cannot withstand direct contact with market forces. That when you do that, you generate artificially feeble truth-seeking mechanisms, and it eventually invades them all. So how hard is it to beat the mainstream news outlets? Not very hard, because they're so bad at delivering
Not very hard at analysis. It's very hard to beat them at some kind of
competition.
Right.
Competitively, they're extremely dominant. But in terms of what they're trying to deliver, they're terrible. Likewise, the university system. And so, you know, what we're, you know, to return to the conversation of a few minutes ago, the authoritarians confront people. Most people capitulate because it's just cheaper and they don't have anything worth fighting over. Those people who don't capitulate turn out to be intellectually interesting for reasons that have nothing to do with the issue they were confronted over. Why is that? It's because all of those fields have become stuck. The market forces have caused them to adopt some wrong assumptions and then to be unable to get out of the cul-de-sac. And so feeble fields result in people quietly inventing a better path that never gets traction but is very powerful in terms of understanding what's true. And so anyway, the conversation you're talking about is marvelous to be a part of it, but I think its basic nature is that a lot of people have privately invented some part of the right answer, and they are now finding each other by virtue of technologies that, you know, didn't exist.
Right.